The night Fenris Valtieri stood alone in the ruins of his court, Anastasia Winterbourne was already 300 miles away, gripping a steering wheel with white knuckles, a single text message burning on the passenger seat beside her. She had not seen him in 2 years. The message was not from him. It never would be. Immortal pride ran older and deeper than any wound, and Fenris Valtieri would sooner let the last light leave his eyes than reach out to the woman he had sent away. The message was from Dorian Ashvale, the only vampire left in that crumbling estate, who still had the decency to feel shame, and it read simply, "He is dying. Whatever blood law still binds you to this house, I am begging you to honor it now." Anastasia had read those words standing in the parking lot of St. Meridian General Hospital, still in her scrub top, still smelling of antiseptic, still carrying the small leather medical kit she took everywhere out of habit. Her hands had not trembled. That was the thing about Anastasia Winterbourne that most people failed to understand. She was not fragile. She never had been. The trembling came later, privately, where no one could count it against her. She had driven through the night, and somewhere past the second hour, when the city lights dissolved into forest darkness, and the forest dissolved into the kind of deep country quiet that humans instinctively feared, she let herself feel it. The weight of 2 years pressed down behind her sternum like a fist. 2 years of building a life that did not include him. 2 years of treating human patients who stayed human, of sleeping in an apartment with no secret chambers beneath it, of eating breakfast in daylight and calling that safety. 2 years of telling herself she had made the right choice when he told her to leave. She had believed him then. He had been so convincing. He had stood in the great hall of Valtieri Court, surrounded by his assembled council, and his silver eyes had been cold as February glass, and he had said, in that voice that carried 6 centuries of command in every syllable, that her services were no longer required, that her presence in this court was a political liability he could no longer afford, and that she should consider their arrangement dissolved. She had looked at him for a very long time, she had said, quietly so that only he could hear, because she was standing close enough to feel the preternatural stillness of him, the way his chest did not rise, and will fall the way a human chest would. She had said, "I know what you are doing, Fenris. I know this is not what you want." And he had looked straight through her with those impossible silver eyes and said, "You know nothing about what I want." She had left. Because she was not helpless and she was not stupid, and she understood that some battles could not be won in the moment they were fought. And because something in the hard line of his jaw had told her he was terrified, which was the most frightening thing she had ever seen, because Fenris Valtieri did not get frightened. Now, 2 years later, the iron gates of Valtieri Court appeared in her headlights, and they were standing open. That was wrong. Those gates had not stood open in 3 centuries. She drove through. The estate sprawled across 4 acres at the edge of a mountain forest, built in the Gothic revival style that humans assumed was architectural vanity, and vampires knew was structural memory, every arch and buttress encoding a different blood law, a different ancient vow. The outer grounds were dark. The fountain in the center courtyard had gone dry. 3 of the tall windows along the eastern face of the main building were dark, where they should have had the amber glow of low interior lighting, and one had been shattered outward, the broken glass glittering in the cold grass below. Something bad had happened here, something worse than political maneuvering. Dorian Ashvale met her at the main door. He was one of the younger vampires of the court, perhaps only 2 centuries old, which made him look perpetually 32 in human terms, dark-haired and thin-shouldered in contrast to the classical white-haired pallor of the elder bloodlines. He looked wrecked. His coat was torn at the shoulder, and his eyes carried the particular brightness that vampires got when they were frightened and trying to suppress it. He said, before she could speak, "Thank you for coming. I did not know if you would." "Tell me what happened," she said. She was already moving past him into the entrance hall, her kit in her hand. "Everything. Do not spare details because you think they will upset me." He fell into step beside her. 6 weeks ago, Lord Valtieri's council voted to formally align the court with the Kundrath faction. You know what that means. The Kundrath faction believes humans are a resource, not people, a resource. She kept her voice level. He would never agree to that. He did not. He refused. He stood in this very hall and told 7 council members, 6 of whom were old enough to remember the founding of this court, that he would not dishonor 400 years of Valtieri blood law by treating living beings as cattle, and that any member of this court who wished to pursue that alliance was free to do so without his blessing or his protection. Dorian paused at the foot of the grand staircase. They left, all of them. Within 72 hours, the entire inner council had withdrawn. 3 of the outer guard went with them. The court's formal alliances with the Sarkavine bloodline and the House of Moraval dissolved the same week. Anastasia had stopped walking. He was left completely alone. Not entirely. Myself. 2 of the outer guard who chose loyalty over politics. A human groundskeeper who has worked this estate for 20 years and did not fully understand what he was staying loyal to. Dorian's voice went quiet. And then, 3 weeks ago, they sent an assassin. What kind? The Kundrath faction keeps a class of vampire known as Blood Hollows. They are older vampires who have been ritually stripped of their court bonds through a process that is genuinely horrifying even by the standards of our kind. They feel no court loyalty, no ancient vow, no old world code. They operate on pure contract. This one was very old and very skilled. Anastasia thought of the shattered window. Where is Fenris, his study? 3rd floor. Dorian hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. The Blood Hollow carried a weapon we did not anticipate, a blade treated with an extract of white ash and something we have not been able to identify. It pierced his left side before the guards could intervene. The wound is not healing. That should be impossible for a vampire of his age and bloodline. It has been 3 weeks, and it is not healing. She was already climbing the stairs. Anastasia. Dorian's voice came up after her. He does not know I contacted you. He ordered me, specifically and directly, not to contact you, no. I know, she said. He will not be pleased. I know that too. The corridor on the 3rd floor was long and dark, lit only by the old iron wall sconces that had been part of the original construction. Their electric bulbs a concession to modernity that Fenris had accepted with the pained dignity of a man and allowing his ancestral home to be fitted with plumbing. Anastasia had walked this corridor 100 times over the 3 years she had spent as the court healer, and the muscle memory of it was strange and intimate in her body, the way a song could be, the way a smell could be. She stopped in front of the heavy oak door at the end and did not knock. She opened it and walked in. The study was as she remembered it. Floor-to-ceiling shelves along 3 walls. A massive desk of dark mahogany that looked as though it belonged in a different century, because it did. The cold fireplace, the single tall window with its heavy drapes drawn, the chair behind the desk, and in that chair, Fenris Valtieri. He looked up the moment the door opened, and for one fraction of a second, before the ancient pride could reassert itself, she saw it. The thing he had been hiding for 2 years. The thing he had sent her away rather than show anyone. He looked like what he was. A 600-year-old vampire lord who had been abandoned by everyone he had trusted. Wounded by something that should not have been able to wound him, and sitting alone in the dark, refusing to let any of it mean anything. He was still breathtaking. That had not changed. The white hair, the fine aristocratic structure of his face, the pale skin that seemed lit from within even now, even diminished. The silver eyes that were currently doing their level best to be cold and failing, he said, "You should not be here." She set her kit on the edge of his desk. "Show me the wound." I gave explicit instructions to my remaining staff that you were not to be contacted. I am aware of your instructions. She pulled on a pair of examination gloves with the precise snap of professional habit. Dorian contacted me anyway. You should probably thank him later, once you are feeling less furious. "Show me the wound, Fenris." A very long pause, the kind of pause that contained 6 centuries of pride and at least 2 years of carefully maintained distance. Then slowly, with the careful economy of motion that told her how much it cost him, he rose from the chair. He was still taller than she remembered. Still broader. The white shirt he wore was untucked on the left side, and when he turned to face her fully and lifted it, she made herself look at the wound clinically, made herself be a healer first, and everything else second. It was bad. The entry point was roughly 4 inches below his rib cage, and it had the characteristic deepness of a puncture weapon rather than a blade. 3 weeks old, and it looked as though it had happened yesterday. The edges had not closed. The surrounding tissue carried an unusual discoloration, a grey-purple bruising that was moving, slowly but visibly, in a slow dark bloom beneath the skin. Vampire flesh did not bruise. Vampire flesh healed. This was not healing. She leaned in. She was very close to him. She could feel the absence of warmth that was part of what he was, the uncanny stillness. The faint pressure of his attention focused on her, the way attention from something very old and very powerful always felt. Like standing near something vast, she said, without looking up. Has the discoloration spread since it first appeared? Yes. His voice was carefully neutral. Approximately a centimeter per day. Any other symptoms? My feeding has been less effective. The energy I take from blood metabolizes faster than it should. I am sleeping more than I would normally require. She looked up at him then. He was looking down at her. They were very close, she said. Why did you send me away? His jaw tightened. This is not the relevant conversation. It is entirely the relevant conversation, because the Kundrath faction targeted you specifically when you refused their alliance. And they targeted you specifically because they knew your vulnerabilities. And your most significant political vulnerability for the last 3 years was the fact that your court healer was human. They tried to use me as leverage. You told me to leave so they could not. She held his gaze. I have had 2 years to think it through. Did I get it right? Something moved across his face. It was not quite pain and not quite relief, and it landed somewhere between them like a stone dropped in still water. He said quietly, You were always too perceptive. Was I wrong? A longer silence. No, he said, you were not wrong. She looked back at the wound. She needed to be professional right now. She needed to think. The ash treatment in the blade is documented in older blood law literature. The anticoagulant properties of white ash have been used against vampires for centuries. But there is something else here. The discoloration pattern, the metabolic disruption. This is not just ash. This is a compound. She straightened and looked at him directly. I need to run a full analysis. I have equipment in the car. I also need to know the location of your court's blood law archives, because if the Kundrath faction developed this compound, there may be a counter-agent documented somewhere in the historical texts. Vampire courts do not develop new weapons from scratch. They adapt old ones. This will have precedent. He stared at her for a moment. You drove through the night. Yes. To treat someone who sent you away. To treat someone I care about, who made a very stupid sacrifice that he did not consult me about. She pulled off one of her gloves and met his gaze without flinching. I am going to save your life, Fenris. I am going to do it whether you cooperate or not, but it will go considerably faster if you cooperate. So you can be proud and difficult, or you can be practical. What is it going to be? For the first time in what she suspected had been a very long time, Fenris Valtieri almost smiled. He said, The archives are in the lower level. I will have Dorian take you. She retrieved her gloves and snapped the second one back on. Good. Now sit down. I need to take a tissue sample from the wound margin before I go. He sat down. He did not argue. She noted this as a significant data point. She worked carefully, methodically. With the focused quiet that she had always brought to the practice of healing, that had made her exceptional at it, from the time she was a pre-med student, staying up until 3 in the morning, reading about wound biology because she simply could not stop. She had come to Valtieri Court at 24, fresh from her residency, after answering a discreet medical posting through a network she had not fully understood at the time. She had learned quickly that the court healer position was considered one of the most politically fraught roles in a vampire court structure. Close enough to the Lord to be a target, human enough to be considered a liability by traditionalists, and yet absolutely necessary, because even the most powerful vampires were occasionally wounded by things that vampire biology alone could not address. She had been very good at the job. She had also been very good at ignoring the fact that she was falling in love with the Lord of the Court, right up until she could not ignore it anymore. She took her samples, labeled them, packed them carefully. He watched her the whole time with those silver eyes that missed nothing. She said, because the silence had stretched too long, and she was not good at letting things go unsaid. Were you ever going to tell me the real reason? If the threat had passed, if things had been different. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, There are blood laws older than anything written in those archives downstairs. One of them concerns the formal claiming of a companion by a vampire of a ruling line. If I were to make that claim, to name someone as bound to my court and protected by my blood law, no faction could touch them without declaring open war on the full Valtieri bloodline. He paused. But the claiming is irrevocable. It is an ancient vow that holds for as long as both parties draw breath, and in my case, that is a very long time. She stopped moving. She was still holding the sealed psalm container. You could have told me that option existed. I could have. And then you would have had to decide whether to accept a permanent binding to the court of a vampire who was being politically hunted. On behalf of an ancient vow you could not undo, at 26 years old. His voice was very careful and very controlled, and she could hear underneath it the thing he was controlling. I did not think that was a fair choice to offer you. You had a life. You have a life. That is the most arrogant and the most heartbreaking thing you have ever said to me. She put the sample in her kit. You decided for me. Yes, without asking me, Anne. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and this time neither of them looked away. She said, "We are going to have a very long conversation about that, after I save your life." Something in him seemed to settle, as though a weight that had been held in suspension for 2 years had found a place to rest. He said very quietly, "Yes, after." She went to get her equipment from the car. The night air was cold and sharp, and she stood beside her car for a moment, with her hand on the door handle, looking up at the dark mass of Valtieri Court against the sky, and she breathed it in, the cold and the dark and the particular quality of quiet that belonged to places where old things lived. Her heart was doing something complicated. She let it. Then she opened the car door and got to work. The archives were below the basement level, accessed through a stone staircase behind the wine cellar that was locked with a mechanism requiring blood contact from a registered court member to open. Dorian pressed his palm to the stone panel and the door opened, and Anastasia descended into a room that smelled of very old paper and iron and time. The archive itself was extraordinary. Thousands of documents, some printed in modern reproductions, some preserved in climate-controlled cases, that looked almost comically modern against the stone walls and the iron shelving. Vampire courts had been meticulous record keepers for as long as there had been vampire courts. Blood law was older than most human governments. She and Dorian worked for 5 hours. She set up her portable analysis equipment on a stone-topped table while Dorian pulled relevant texts, translating the older passages from the Latin or the Old Dacian that showed up in the earliest documents. They worked well together. Dorian was precise and surprisingly knowledgeable, and he explained the context of each document with the efficiency of someone who had spent 2 centuries in an institution that valued institutional memory. At the second hour, she found the compound. It was referenced in a text dating from the late 16th century, in a record of a conflict between true rival vampire courts in what was now Romania. One court had developed a weapon called ashblight, a mixture of white ash extract, silver root compound, and a bacteriological agent cultivated from a specific black mold that grew only in the high mountain regions of the Carpathians. The mold produced a toxin that disrupted the cellular repair process unique to vampire biology. The ash provided the vehicle. The silver root prevented the vampire immune system from recognizing the intrusion as a foreign agent. The mold toxin did the actual damage. And at the bottom of the same document, in a different hand, added in what the notation style suggested, was the late 18th century. There was a counter-agent. She read it twice to be sure. Then she looked at Dorian. "How modern is your supply room?" she said. "Fully stocked," he said. "Lord Valtieri has always maintained it to human medical standards, regardless of what the council thought about it." "Because of me," she said. And it was not quite a question. Dorian's expression was kind and a little sad. He never had it restocked between court healers before you arrived. After you left, he had it fully restocked within the week and ordered it maintained. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I need 3 specific compounds and I need access to a preparation space, and I need about 4 hours." "You will have everything you need," Dorian said. She worked through the rest of the night and into the grey pre-dawn hours. The counter-agent required careful preparation. the base compound from the archive text translated into modern pharmaceutical equivalents that she was confident of, with one modification she made based on 2 years of additional study she had done in her own time. When she had first left the court, in the first weeks, when the grief of it was raw, and she had needed something to do with her hands and her mind, she had poured herself into research on vampire physiology and the documented interaction of blood law compounds with supernatural biology. She had told herself it was for professional reasons. She had known it was not entirely for professional reasons. She had spent 2 years studying, in case she ever needed to come back and help him. She was not going to tell him that. Not yet. Dawn came and went. Vampires of Fenris's age could tolerate indirect light for short periods, but the automatic blackout systems throughout the estate sealed at sunrise, and Anastasia appreciated the controlled environment. She brought the prepared compound upstairs at mid-morning. He was awake. He was at the desk again, reading, though she could see from the careful stillness of his posture that it was costing him something. The wound was slowing him. Not enough to show to anyone else, probably, but she knew him, she said. "I have it." He set down the document he was holding. She explained the compound, the mechanism of the ash blight toxin, the counter-agent she had prepared, and the process of administration. She was methodical and clear, and she used the language of medicine the way she always did when she needed the intellectual framework to hold steady against the emotional one. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known about ash blight?" "The text in the archive is 6 centuries old. I found a reference to it in an obscure pharmaceutical text about 18 months ago. I researched the counter-agent as a theoretical exercise." She met his eyes. I told myself it was academic. He was very still. "Anastasia." "Do not," she said, not harshly. "Let me finish the job first." He let her finish the job. The administration was a 2-stage process. The first compound was an intravenous treatment to address the mold toxin in his bloodstream, and the second was a topical preparation applied directly to the wound to begin closing the damage the ash had prevented from healing. The first stage would take 30 minutes. The second required her to work directly on the wound site for as long as it took. She sat beside him in a chair she had pulled close to his. She worked the IV line with the same careful competence she applied to everything. His arm was cool and still under her hands in the way that vampire flesh was, the veins visible and present but carrying something other than warmth. He was watching her face. She said, without looking up, "What are you going to do about the Kundrath faction?" "I had been asking myself the same question," he said. "They will not stop. They sent the blood hollow as a message. If the message were failed, they will send something else. You cannot face them alone. I am aware. You also cannot rebuild your court quickly. Court bonds take time, and anyone who would court bond to a house that just lost its entire council for political reasons is going to need convincing." She adjusted the IV line. "Unless you use the claiming," he said nothing. "If you formally claimed a companion," she said carefully, "that companion's presence in the court would be protected under Valtieri blood law. It would also signal to every allied court and every neutral faction that Valtieri court has a formal companion bond in place, which means the ancient vow is active, which means attacking you becomes significantly more costly from a blood law standpoint. A companion claiming is not a political strategy," he said. His voice was very even. "It is an ancient vow. It is the oldest binding in vampire law. It is not a tool." "I know what it is," she said. She looked up at him then. "I am not suggesting you use it as a tool. I am pointing out that the political consequence happens to align with what I believe and what I think you believe, and what Dorian clearly believes is the appropriate course of action regardless of politics." The study was very quiet. He said, "You have been gone 2 years. You made a choice that I had no say in. I dealt with it. I am dealing with it now by being here." She held his gaze. "The question I am asking is whether you intend to keep making choices about my life for me, or whether you intend to let me make them with you." The morning light, filtered through the estate's blackout panels, gave everything in the room a dimmed, amber quality. In that light, with the IV line in his arm and the silver of his eyes focused entirely on her, she watched 6 centuries of immortal pride have a quiet reckoning with something it had not known quite what to do with. He said, When you were here, in this court, for 3 years, I watched the council's reaction to you change month by month. They were uncomfortable with a human healer initially. That is the traditional view. Humans in a vampire court are temporary, peripheral, and controllable. You were none of those things. You had opinions about blood law. You argued with Councillor Vashkovith about the ethics of the old hunting codes in front of the full court, and you won the argument, and he knew you won the argument, and he hated you for it. I remember, she said. When the Kundrath faction made their first approach to the council, approximately 4 months before the vote, the initial negotiation document included a specific clause. I read it. The clause stated that all human staff of the court would be reclassified under the new alliance as non-citizen resources, subject to the resource protocols of the Kundrath Charter. She kept her face still. I want you to understand, he said, that I had every resource of this court directed at finding an alternative for approximately 3 months before the council vote. I was looking for a legal mechanism within blood law that would protect you without the claiming, because the claiming is permanent, and I did not want to trap you in something permanent without your knowledge or your consent. He paused. There is no such mechanism. The only protections that exist for a human companion within a vampire court of this age are either the full claiming or the court lord's personal protection, which is only as strong as the court lord's political standing, which the council was actively working to destroy. The first stage of the treatment was completing. She watched the monitor readout carefully. The compound was working. She could see the subtle shift in the wound's presentation already. She said, "So you chose to send me away rather than tell me any of this. I chose to give you your freedom rather than chain you to a court that was falling apart around an immortal who could not protect you the way you deserved." She removed the IV line with careful precision. She prepared the second stage compound. She said very quietly, "Fenris, I am a healer. I chose this work. I chose this court. I chose to spend 3 years of my life in a place most humans will never know exists, learning a form of medicine that has no peer-reviewed literature and no professional community and no safety net, because it mattered and because you mattered." She looked at him. "You do not get to decide that the choice is too permanent for me. That is my choice. That has always been my choice." He was very still in the way that he got when something had reached through the 6th century armor and found something real underneath. She said, "Lie back. I need to treat the wound directly." He lay back in the chair, adjusting it to a reclined position with the patient and deliberate movements of someone to whom pain was a relatively new inconvenience. She moved close, kneeling beside him, and began to apply the second compound to the wound. She worked in silence for a while. The compound required careful application, worked into the wound margins in a specific sequence that the archive text had described, and that she had cross-referenced with everything she knew about vampire cellular biology. She was completely focused. The work was absorbing, he said. "After a long time, I missed you." She kept working. Her hands were very steady, he said. "Every day, I want you to know that. Not because it changes what I did or makes it right, but because you said I decided things without telling you. And that was one of the things I decided not to tell you." "I know," she said. "I missed you too every day." She smoothed the compound carefully along the wound edge. "What I built in these 2 years is real. My career, my patience, my life. I am not going to pretend I was sitting in a room waiting. I was living." "I know," he said. "I would not want you to have done otherwise. But I was also studying vampire biochemistry in my spare time and researching ashblight counteragents on the off chance that you needed me." She glanced up briefly. "So?" The ghost of something crossed his face. It was, she thought, the closest thing to vulnerable she had ever seen from him, and it was more powerful for being so contained. He said, "Tell me what you want. I want to come back. I want to help rebuild this court on terms that I am part of deciding. I want the claiming to be a mutual choice that we make together, in full knowledge of what it means, not a political maneuver, and not a desperate measure." She sat back slightly to assess her work. The wound was beginning to respond. The discoloration was retreating. Something in her chest unknotted. "And I want you to never again make a decision about my safety or my future without talking to me first. That is non-negotiable." "That is a reasonable set of terms," he said.
"I have more I expected you might."
She looked at him then, both of them looking at each other in the amber-dimmed morning light of the study where she had first met him, where he had interviewed her for the court healer position, with the focused intensity of someone who did not believe she was qualified and was being shown, with increasing certainty, that he was wrong. She had argued with for 40 minutes in this room, on their first meeting, about the documented efficacy of silver compound treatments versus the traditional blood-drinking recovery methods favored by old-line vampire medicine. She had referenced 3 different sources. He had been, though he would not have admitted it at the time, delighted, she said. I want you to be honest with me about the things that are frightening you, even when it goes against everything 6 centuries of vampire nobility has taught you about what you are allowed to show. A very long silence. Outside, something moved in the distant grounds, Dorian doing his morning patrol, the quiet sound of old stones settling. That, he said, will require practice. I know, she said. I am patient. He reached out and took her hand. Not in the way of someone asking for comfort, but in the way of someone making a statement. His hand was cool, and his grip was careful and certain, and he held her hand the way things that do not break hold things that matter. She let him, she said. The wound will close fully within 48 hours. Given the response I am already seeing, metabolic disruption should resolve within a week. You will need 2 follow-up treatments. She looked at their joined hands and then at him. I am going to be here for all of them. I know, he said. And the way he said it carried something she recognized as the absolute certainty of a vampire lord who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. And this time the decision was not about sending her away. This time the decision was exactly the opposite. The days that followed had the quality of reconstruction. Not the clean, fast reconstruction of things that had simply fallen apart, but the careful, considered reconstruction of things that needed to be rebuilt better than they had been before. Anastasia treated the wound on the 2nd morning and the 3rd. Each time the improvement was measurable and consistent. Fenris moved more freely by the 3rd day. The discoloration was gone. The edges of the wound were finally beginning to close with the speed that vampire biology was supposed to produce, no longer blocked by the ash compound and the mold toxin. He watched her work with the focused attention he gave everything, and she found herself as she had found herself 3 years ago in this court, talking while she worked. She had always done that, talked through her observations, her reasoning, her process. Most patients found it reassuring. Fenris had always found it fascinating in a way he had initially been very careful not to show. She told him about her work at St. Meridian, the things she had learned. A paper she had written on wound healing in immunocompromised patients that had been published in a journal and had pleased her in the specific, quiet way that intellectual recognition pleased her. He listened to all of it with complete attention. He asked precise, intelligent questions. He had always done that. On the 3rd evening, when the treatment was done and she was cleaning up, Dorian appeared in the doorway with an expression that had gone from careful professionalism to something more openly worried. We have received a communication from the Kundrath faction, he said. Fenris was on his feet immediately. The 3 weeks of diminishment fell away in an instant. He was simply and entirely the lord of this court, all of the regal authority and dangerous certainty back in place. And Anastasia watched it happen with the particular feeling of someone who knew both versions of him and loved them both. What does it say? Fenris asked. Dorian came in and placed a sealed document on the desk. They are requesting a formal conference. They claim they wish to negotiate. They cite the Blood Hollow incident as an unauthorized act by a rogue operative. They are lying, Anastasia said. Yes, Dorian agreed. Obviously, however. He opened the document. They have also sent simultaneously a communication to every neutral court in the regional federation, announcing their intention to negotiate with Lord Valtieri and citing a list of good faith measures they claim to be offering. They are creating a public record, Fenris said. If I refuse the conference, the narrative becomes that I am the one refusing peace. Yes, and if I attend the conference, I attend it as a politically isolated court lord with an incomplete guard and no counsel. Which makes it a trap. Also, yes. Anastasia set down her kit and looked at both of them. Then we change what they find when they arrive. What is the minimum viable structure required for a formal conference under vampire law? Dorian blinked. A court lord, 2 court officers, a registered companion or court healer, a neutral party witness from an allied house. She looked at Fenris. He looked at her. She said, "You have a court lord. Dorian is a court officer. I am the court healer. If you make the claiming formal before the conference, I become a registered companion, which satisfies that requirement and also activates the Valtieri blood law protections." She paused. That covers 3 of the 4. Who would serve as a neutral witness? Fenris was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "House Elvereth, they have maintained neutrality in the Kundrath conflict thus far, and I have a long-standing personal relationship with their current lord." Dorian straightened. "You have not spoken with Lord Cairn Elvereth in nearly a decade. He will speak with me." Something in Fenris's voice was absolute. He owes me a debt from the Blood Compact of 1987, and he has always honored his debts. He looked at Anastasia. He will need to be told about the compound, the blood hollow, the full situation. Then tell him, she said, fully and honestly, if he is the kind of person who will witness for you. He deserves to understand what he is witnessing for. Fenris looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not fully name, something old and certain and deeply warm beneath the silver. He said, "Before we do any of this, I would like to discuss the claiming, as you said. Together. Fully," she said. Yes, let us do that." Dorian excused himself with the particular diplomatic efficiency of a vampire who knew when to leave a room. And Anastasia and Fenris were alone in the study with the fire lit, because he had asked Dorian to lay the fire before the conversation, and she had noticed that and filed it away alongside the supply room that had been kept stocked for 2 years, and the blood law research he had done, looking for alternatives, and the 40-minute argument on the day they first met. He explained the claiming fully, as he had not fully explained it before. It was older than any written blood law. It predated the formal courts, predated the regional federation, predated almost everything in the archives below. In its original form, it had been the vow a vampire made to a companion whose life they chose to be responsible for. Not in the sense of ownership, but in the older sense of witness. I see you. I choose you. You are part of what I protect because you are part of what I am. The formal legal structure had accreted around it over centuries, giving it its protections and its permanence, but the core of it was older than law. It bound them both. Not because it compelled anything, but because it was a witnessed vow made before whatever old things witnessed such vows, and Fenris, who had lived 600 years and seen empires fall, believed in the old things in the way that people who had been present for the original events tended to believe in them. She listened to all of it. She said, "The permanence. Walk me through what that means practically." "You have said it lasts as long as both parties draw breath. I am human. My life is finite." Something moved across his face. It was brief and contained and entirely honest. "Yes, and you are not. No." She considered this with the same methodical care she brought to any complex problem. "That means, at some point, you will lose me." "Yes," he said, very quietly. "Does that change what you want?" "No," he said. "It does not." She looked at him. He was sitting across from her, with his hands resting still on the desk, and his silver eyes entirely clear, and she understood that this was the most honest he had been with anyone in a very long time. Possibly longer than she could imagine. She said, "I would like to think about it for exactly 1 more day. Not because I am uncertain about what I want. I know what I want. But because I have spent 2 years building a life, and I want to walk into this decision with full clarity, not with the momentum of crisis." She held his gaze. "Is that acceptable?" "More than acceptable," he said. "It is exactly what I should have offered you 2 years ago." She smiled then. It was not a complicated smile. It was the smile of someone who had come a very long way and was beginning at last to feel the weight settle into its proper place. She said, "Then let us contact Lord Elvereth." Cairn Elvereth arrived the following afternoon. He was older than Fenris in vampire years, which meant that he appeared as a man of perhaps 45. Dark-eyed and silver-haired in the way of all old bloodlines, with the particular quality of age-lightened presence that the oldest vampires carried, not diminishment but distillation. He moved through Valtieri Court with the ease of someone who had known the estate when it was newly built, and he greeted Fenris with an embrace that Anastasia found moving. Two ancient beings who had lived through centuries of the same world finding each other still standing. Karen Elvereth turned his dark eyes to her. So this is the healer who kept the court stocked and waiting for 2 years. Dorian told you that, Fenris said. Dorian told me many things. Elvereth agreed unrepentantly. He studied Anastasia with the kind of frank, intelligent appraisal that old vampires used on people they were trying to understand quickly. And you are going to accept the claiming. I am going to make that decision today, yes, she said. Good, he said. Because Fenris has needed someone who could hold their ground since the previous century, and in my observation it is quite difficult to find. Fenris said with the tone of a man who had been managing a very old friendship for a very long time. Karen, I am simply being factual. He turned back to Fenris. Tell me everything about the Kundrath faction, the Blood Hollow, and what you need from me at this conference. They met in the formal receiving room, the 4 of them. Fenris, Anastasia, Dorian, Karen. Fenris laid out the full situation with the precise, unsparing honesty he had learned to apply, she thought, in the last several days, and Karen listened and asked sharp questions and did not flinch from anything. Anastasia contributed the medical details, the compound analysis, the documentation she had prepared. Dorian provided the legal and political context. At the end, Karen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is not a negotiation. This is an attempt to assess your current strength and prepare a second strike." "Yes," Fenris said. "Then you need them to find something that makes a second strike politically non-viable. The claiming handles the companion clause. My witnessing handles the allied house requirement. But you also need something that tells the Kundrath faction that further action against Valtieri court will cost them something specific." Anastasia said. "What if they knew the counteragent to the Ashblight compound existed, was documented, and was held by this court?" Everyone looked at her. She said, "The Ashblight compound was their specific weapon as a vampire of Fenris's bloodline and age. They developed it or obtained it because they believed it would be uniquely effective and uniquely difficult to counter. If they know that we have a counteragent, the weapon loses its value, and if we communicate through Karen as a neutral witness, that the documentation of both the weapon and the counteragent has been formally archived with the Regional Federation's Record Office, any further use of the compound against this court becomes evidence of premeditated violation of the anti-compound accords, which is blood law criminal at the federal level." A silence, Dorian said with clear admiration. "That is extraordinarily well considered." Karen looked at Fenris. "Where did you find her?" "She found me," Fenris said. "She argued about wound treatment protocols for 40 minutes in this room, and she was right about all of it." Anastasia said, "Can someone confirm whether the Regional Federation's Record Office will accept the documentation? I want to be certain we are working with correct information before we build a strategy on it." Seren said, "I can make that call within the hour. I have a standing relationship with the Federal Archivist." "Then please do that," she said. "We have approximately 30 hours before the conference." He made the call. The answer was yes. That evening, Anastasia sat in the garden. The estate's garden was an enclosed space along the south face of the main building, accessible through a set of French doors from the lower level, designed in the formal style of the late 18th century, with clipped hedges and a central stone bench and old roses that bloomed in summer, though it was autumn now and the roses were finished. She sat on the bench in a coat, in the cold, looking at the dark garden, and she thought. She was good at thinking. She had always been good at it. Clarity was something she worked for. She did not assume it. She built it. The way she built everything. She was 28 years old. She had a career she loved. She had a life that was real and full and hers. She had walked back into this court 3 days ago, and every part of her had recognized it, the way you recognized a language you grew up speaking, the shape of it in your mouth. She thought about what it meant to bind herself to this court, to this person, specifically and completely. She thought about his hands on hers in the study. She thought about 40 minutes of argument on a first meeting and 3 years of learning what it felt like to be fully known by someone. Every intelligent and difficult and non-fragile thing about her met with something that was not just tolerance but genuine appreciation, the deep pleasure of someone finally, with another person who could match them. She thought about the 2 years apart, which had been fine, genuinely fine, and also had been the absence of something she did not have a different name for except him. She thought about the permanence, about her mortality and his immortality, and the knowledge that this would end, someday, with her death and his continued existence. She thought about whether that was something she could hold, not with despair, but with the realistic, honest eyes of someone who had spent her professional life in hospitals where mortality was a daily reality, and also, consistently, not the only reality. She thought, I have never met anyone, human or otherwise, who made me feel the way I feel in that study. And I have lived alone with that knowledge for 2 years. And I know what I want. She went back inside. He was in the hallway near the garden door. He was not pacing, because Fenris Valtieri did not pace, but he was standing in the hallway in a way that suggested he had been standing there for some time, waiting without being willing to wait obtrusively. She said, yes. He looked at her. She said, the answer to the question that we agreed I would take a day to consider. The answer is yes. I want the claiming. I want to come back to this court. I want all of it. And I am making this decision with full clarity and no momentum of crisis, because I have been sitting in your garden being very thorough about it. He moved toward her with the quiet, deliberate certainty of someone who had been still for a very long time and was no longer going to be. He stopped in front of her, close, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the study, with the silver eyes and the 6 centuries, and the thing that lived underneath all of it that was entirely, unmistakably, and specifically about her. He said, the claiming is traditionally spoken at midnight in the presence of a witness, in the language of the original blood law. I know, she said. Dorian explained the protocol. You asked Dorian to explain the protocol. Of course I did. I researched things. She looked up at him. Is Karen prepared to witness? He has been ready since this afternoon, Fenris said, and something in his voice made her smile. The warm and genuine smile that she knew landed on her face without any performance, because she was happy, directly and simply happy, in a way that felt earned. He said, Anastasia. She said, I know. He said, you came back. She said, I told you I knew what you were doing. The day you sent me away, I told you that. She held his gaze. I was always going to come back when it mattered. You should have known that. I did know it, he said. I was afraid of it. I know, she said softly. You are allowed to be afraid of things. Not many people would say that to me. I am not many people. No, he said, you are not. At midnight in the great hall of Valtieri Court, with Karin Elvereth as witness and Dorian, standing at formal attention in his capacity as court officer, Fenris Valtieri spoke the ancient claiming words in the old language, which was older than Latin and had no modern name, and Anastasia Winterbourne answered in the response form that Fenris had written out for her phonetically, and which she had memorized with the focus she brought to everything worth memorizing. The words were simple at their core, older than the legal structure built around them, older than the courts, older than all of the politics and the blood law, and the faction conflicts and the centuries of recorded history in the archive below. They said, in essence, I see you, I choose you. As long as I draw breath, you are held. Both of them said the words. That was how it was designed, because the ancient vow had always been mutual. When it was done, Karin Elvereth said in the formal witnessing voice, the vow is spoken and witnessed. The bond is held under Valtieri blood law, the ancient claiming, and my house's witnessing compact. So it is recorded. Then he said, in a completely different tone, wonderful. Is there anything to drink in this court, or did the entire cellar leave with the council? Dorian said, with the expression of someone who had been holding professional composure for several hours. The cellar is fully intact, my lord. I would suggest the 1952 Margot. The conference with the Kundrath faction took place the following morning in the formal receiving room. The 3 representatives they sent were careful fest vampires in expensive modern suits with old eyes, and they entered the room and found Fenris Valtieri standing at the head of his formal conference table, entirely recovered, entirely himself, all of the regal authority and dangerous certainty fully present and in the room like a physical weight. Beside him stood Anastasia, introduced formally as his claimed companion and court healer, The claiming registered that morning with the Regional Federation's record office through Karin's contact. Karin Elvereth stood as neutral witness, and the senior Kundrath representative's eyes went to him with the involuntary sharpness of someone recalculating rapidly. Dorian presented the documentation. The Ashblight compound analysis, the historical archive reference, the counter-agent documentation, all of it formally logged with the federal archivist at 6 that morning. The senior representative said, "We are here to discuss a peace arrangement," Fenris said. "You are here because you sent a blood hollow to assassinate me with a prohibited compound, and it did not work. You are here because a formal record of that attempt now exists in the federal archive. And you are here because you need to determine whether this court intends to pursue federal action against the Kundrath faction, which I assure you I have full documentation to support." A silence. Fenris said, "I am going to offer you one path out of this. You will formally withdraw from any claim of negotiation rights with the former members of my council. You will formally acknowledge, in a witness document, that the Blood Hollow operative was acting under Kundrath direction. You will pay the formal blood law restitution to this court, as defined by the federal code for use of a prohibited compound in an assassination attempt. And you will take your alliance proposals back to whatever table you developed them at, and you will leave my court and every court that chooses to remain unaffiliated with your faction in peace." He paused. He said, "In exchange, I will not submit the assassination documentation to the federal tribunal, which would result in the Kundrath faction losing its federal recognition and its formal status under blood law entirely." The representatives exchanged looks. They were calculating, she could see it. They were calculating what they had and what they were facing, and they were not finding the numbers they had expected when they walked in. The senior representative said, "This is not the negotiation we were offered." "No," Fenris agreed, "it is not. The negotiation you were offered was a trap for a weakened court lord with no counsel and no companion and no allied witness. What you found instead was considerably more inconvenient. I suggest you take the path I have offered. It took 2 hours. There were attempts at renegotiation, at reframing, at the kind of political maneuvering that old vampires were capable of sustaining for long periods." Fenris counted each one with the focused precision of someone who had been doing this for 6 centuries and had prepared specifically for this morning. Anastasia contributed twice when the discussion turned to the medical documentation, providing clinical detail with the authority that came from having actually analyzed the compound, and both times she watched the representatives recalibrate because she had not been in their calculations and she was demonstrably not peripheral. In the end, they signed. Karin witnessed the document. Dorian filed it with the federal office before the representatives had reached their cars. When the great doors of Valtieri Court closed behind the last representative, Karin said, "That was exceptionally well done." Fenris said nothing for a moment. He stood at the head of his formal conference table in his own great hall, and he looked at Anastasia, and what passed between them in that look was not a conversation that required words. He said to the room, "Dorian, please arrange a formal communication to the courts of the Regional Federation notifying them that Valtieri Court is operating under a full claiming bond and will be receiving applications for alliance discussions over the next 6 months." Dorian said, "With pleasure, my lord." Karin said, "I will begin making introductions. There are 3 courts I know of immediately that have been waiting for a signal that Valtieri was stable before reaching out. The isolation was always political theatre as much as it was genuine abandonment. Once the council left and the Kundrath pressure mounted, people were waiting to see how you would come through it." He looked at Fenris with the warm, direct expression of a very old friend, and now they have seen. Fenris said, "Thank you, Karin. I owe you more than a debt from 1987. "You owe me nothing," Karin said. "I owed you a debt and I paid it, and it was my genuine pleasure. But if there is wine left in that cellar, I would consider the afternoon well spent." The months that followed were not dramatic in the way that the crisis had been dramatic. They were the kind of months that looked ordinary from outside and felt, from inside, like building something that would last. Anastasia negotiated the structure of her return. She maintained her position at St. Meridian 3 days a week. because she loved her human patients and her human work, and she was not prepared to give up the life she had built. She spent the rest of her time at Valtieri Court, which over the autumn and into the winter began slowly and carefully to restore itself. 2 new court officers came on in October, vampires of younger bloodlines who had been watching the situation and chosen their allegiance thoughtfully. A formal alliance with House Elvereth was signed in November. The former council did not return. Fenris did not pursue them, and they did not attempt further action. The document they had signed, witnessed, and federally filed was enough. The Old World Code still had teeth when properly invoked. Anastasia reorganized the court medical facility. She expanded the supply room, created a proper documentation system for treatment records, and began developing what she thought of privately as the foundation of a real field of practice. Medicine for supernatural beings, drawing on both human medical science and the historical records in the archive below. She was meticulous about it. She was excited about it in the deep, absorbing way. She got excited about things that genuinely mattered. She told Fenris about it one evening in November, sitting in the study with the fire lit and the drapes open to the dark garden, because she always liked to see the garden even in winter. She talked through the whole concept, the gaps in existing knowledge, the cases she had already encountered, the potential structure of something that could eventually be documented and shared with other courts that kept human healers. He listened to all of it, the way he always listened, completely and without interruption. And when she finished, he said, "The archive here has documents that have never been fully translated or analyzed. You would have unrestricted access to all of it." "I know," she said. "I already have a list." He smiled, fully, openly. It was not something that had happened often in 6 centuries, probably, but it was happening more now. She had decided to take full credit for this. She said, "What are you going to do about the council?" "Long term. You had 7 members before. You have 2 court officers now." "I am rebuilding it differently," he said. "The old council structure was inherited from the original founding charter. It made sense for a different era. What I want is something more deliberately designed." He paused. "I have been thinking about whether a human member of the council is legally viable under current blood law." She turned from the garden to look at him. He said, "You hold the full claiming bond. The claiming gives you the legal standing of a court principal. There is nothing in the current federal code that explicitly prohibits a court principal who is human from holding a council seat." He held her gaze with the silver eyes that she knew now in all their variations: cold authority, quiet warmth, focused intensity, and this, which was something she had started to think of as his private certainty, the expression he had when he had decided something was right and was offering it. "I thought you should know the option exists. The decision is yours." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to think through the implications clearly. "I would want it to be on merit," she said, "not on the claiming." "It would be," he said. "The merit case is not difficult to make. You have provided more substantive contribution to this court's political stability in the last 2 months than the previous council provided in its final year," she said. "Then, yes. When you are ready to formally reconstitute the council, I would like to be considered," he said. "I already have the paperwork." She laughed. The fire crackled. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall in the dark garden, light and quiet. Settling on the clipped hedges and the empty rose beds and the stone bench where she had sat in autumn to think through the most important decision of her life. He rose from the desk and came to stand beside her at the window, and she was aware of his presence the way she was always aware of it, the cool stillness and the focused attention and the ancient, certain weight of someone who had chosen her. He said, "Are you happy?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "Yes, are you?" He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of someone who was very carefully being honest. He said, "I am not certain I have a clear comparison point. For most of my existence, the question would not have been the relevant one." He looked at the snow. "But this, what I am now, in this court with you, is what I would choose. Every version of the choice leads here. That seems like the relevant thing. That is a very you way of saying yes," she said. "I am aware." She turned from the window and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and she lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest, where his heart beat slowly and steadily. Nothing like a human heart in its rhythm, something older and different and entirely real. She said, I chose this, I want you to know that. Not the crisis, and not the momentum, and not the blood law. I chose you. The person who argued with me for 40 minutes on a first meeting, and turned out to be right about 2 of the 3 points. I was right about all 3, he said. You were right about 2, she said. I have documentation. Something in his face settled into the expression she had come to know best, the one that was not regal or dangerous or ancient or politically strategic, the one that was simply and specifically his response to her, which she suspected almost no one else had ever seen. He said her name the way he said it when no one else was in the room. Anastasia, she said. I know. He bent his head and kissed her, in the firelight and the snow quiet, in the court that had been abandoned and was now being rebuilt, in the life they were making together out of ancient vows and modern medicine and the deep, accumulated weight of choosing each other across every difficult moment and all the ordinary ones too. She kissed him back with all of herself, the way she did everything, completely and without reservation, and outside the snow fell on the old stones of Valtieri Court, and the fire held its light, and the long hard dark of the last 2 years was over. In the spring, the council was formally reconstituted. 5 members, including Dorian Ashvile as first officer, Karin Elvereth's recommended candidate from House Velasquez, a vampire named Serafindra Morn, who turned out to be one of the most precise legal minds Anastasia had encountered in any species, and 2 others carefully chosen for both competence and genuine commitment to the Valtieri principles that Fenris had defended when he stood alone against a full council vote and refused to call human beings a resource. Anastasia held the 5th seat. She had prepared for her investiture with the same focused thoroughness she brought to everything, had read the full founding charter and the 3 subsequent revisions, and had a list of questions about the 3rd revision's ambiguity in the companion rights clause that she intended to raise at the first formal meeting. Karin Elvereth attended the investiture as a guest. He stood afterward at the reception, which was modest by the formal standards of vampire courts, and deliberately so, and said to Fenris, You have rebuilt something considerably better than what you had, Fenris said. I had good help. Karin looked at Anastasia, who was across the room having what appeared to be an animated discussion with Serafindra Morn about the 3rd revision of the founding charter. He said, She is the kind of person courts are built around. The old courts understood that, before they forgot it. The founding compact was written with a human co-author. Did you know? Most people have forgotten. He paused. She will remember. She is exactly the kind of person who will find that text and remember it. Fenris watched her across the room with an expression that was not publicly visible to most of the people in it, but was entirely legible to Karin, who had known him for 4 centuries and recognized it without difficulty. Yes, Fenris said. She will. She looked across the room at him, at that moment the way people who are attuned to each other do, with the specific awareness of someone who has learned to read their person across distances. She met his eyes. She smiled, the direct, unperformative smile. Then she turned back to Serafindra and said something that made the ancient vampire laugh, which was apparently something Serafindra Morn did rarely, and which therefore meant something significant. Later, when the guests had gone and the court was quiet, and the spring night lay soft over the garden, where the roses were just beginning to bud, Anastasia and Fenris walked in the garden together in the way they had developed over the winter. A regular evening walk through the formal paths that she had learned to love in all weathers. She had discovered sometime in February that Fenris had maintained the garden personally during the years of her absence, which he had not mentioned, and which she had found out through the groundskeeper, who had told her with the unguarded honesty of someone who had worked for 20 years in a place, and had strong feelings about its inhabitants. She had not told Fenris she knew this. She carried it warmly and privately. There would be a moment to tell him someday, and she was not in any hurry, he said, walking beside her. The 3rd revision's companion rights clause, she said, is genuinely ambiguous in subsection 4, I know. I saw you see my list. Serafindra has been frustrated by that ambiguity for years, he said. She has a proposed amendment. I would like to read it. I will have Dorian send it to you. They walked. The roses were small and pale in the early spring night. not yet fully open, full of the specific potential of things, not yet at their peak. The stone paths were cool and familiar under her feet. She said, "I want to tell you something." He waited, she said. "When I drove here in October, I had a message from Dorian saying you were dying. I was in the parking lot of a hospital in Scrubs, and I read it and I did not hesitate for 1 second about whether to come. Not because of the blood law or the claiming or any obligation, because it was you and I would always come for you." She looked at the roses. "I want you to know that. Not as a declaration, just as a fact about me, so you have it." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He said, "I sent you away so that you would be safe. I know, and the cost of that was 2 years. Yes, and you have not, in all of this time, once suggested that I do not deserve your forgiveness for it." "You do not need my forgiveness for it," she said. "You made a terrible decision for loving reasons. I understand those. I just needed you to promise not to do it again." "I promised," he said. "You did," she said. "I believed you." He took her hand. They stood in the spring garden of the court he had defended alone against a full council and a political faction and an assassin's blade, and the ancient vow they had spoken in the midnighted great hall bound them in the oldest and simplest terms, the terms older than any blood law or court charter. "I see you, I choose you. As long as I draw breath, you are held." Both of them had said the words. She leaned into him, her shoulder against his chest, and felt the slow beat of the ancient heart that would outlast her by centuries, that had been patient for 600 years before she argued her way into a study and into his full and irreversible attention. And she thought, "This is what I chose. This is exactly what I chose." The roses would be fully open in another week. The new council would convene in the morning. The court was alive and rebuilding and filled, for the first time in its long history, with something that had not been part of its original design, but that made it stronger for being present. They stayed in the garden until the night turned toward dawn. Then they went inside, into the lit warmth of the court that was theirs. Together, and the doors of Valtieri Court closed quietly behind them, and the spring dark was peaceful over the old stones, and everything that had been broken was held, and everything that had been lost was home.